This is episode 10 of Youthful Perspectives. I'm your host, Mason Beerbaum. My guest today is a grassroots organizer, public policy expert, and the executive director at North Star Prosperity, Mike Dean. Mike has been focused on public policy since he was in high school and has played pivotal roles in many projects like the building of Huntington Bank Stadium and the passage of the North Star Promise Act. During our conversation, we talked about these two items and the work that went into creating them. We also discussed the three legs to an effective grassroots movement, the role of media relations and public policy advocacy, and commented on the current state of politics and what it might mean for the future of our country. I know Mike is a busy man, so I was grateful to sit down and talk with him. And now, here's Mike Dean. Thank you, Mike, for joining me today. I appreciate it. Start off right away. Where did you grow up?
So again, my name is Mike Dean. I'm the executive director of North Star Prosperity, and I grew up here in Minnesota. So I went to Stillwater High School and lived in the city of Lake Elmo for pretty much my whole life, and then went to school down at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Go Badgers!
Oh, starting off with that right away.
And just had a phenomenal experience there. Worked down D.C. for a while and then came back here, but have been a native Minnesotan my entire life.
All right. I guess we'll let that slide then, being a Badgers fan. When you were at the University of Wisconsin, what were you studying?
So I did political science and international relations,
Okay.
But I would say I got my degree in sort of civic engagement, really. And so at the University of Wisconsin, here at University of Minnesota, there's just lots of opportunities to engage and work outside the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that's where my real classroom was for me. And so I think freshman year, I ran for student government, got super involved with that, ran our Get Out the Vote campaign. And then, and then helped out on a presidential campaign. So that was 2000. So I got to spend a lot of time in Iowa,
Nice.
And helped out and learned out how the Iowa caucuses work. That was just a phenomenal experience and met a lot of friends there that I still talk to or still in politics now to this day. And then junior year, I decided to run for city council. And that was probably the biggest education I got. So learning how to run a campaign, how to fundraise, how to talk to people, sort of build support. And that was just an amazing experience. Won the primary and then ended up losing the general election by 5 votes.
Wow. 5 votes.
And I was just a student at the time. What was I? I was probably 19 years old, and ran against a union organizer. So this is some guy in his upper 20s, had been doing this type of stuff for years, and just got really close. But now looking back on it, just would obviously do things differently. But that experience of running a campaign, losing, and kind of walking through that, I think has prepared me super well for life.
Yeah, absolutely. I know James Carville has always said you can learn more from losing a campaign than winning a campaign. And I'm sure that's probably the case for you in the sense of that initial high of winning that primary at the age of 19 and then eventually losing by 5 votes to that union organizer. I mean, it's frustrating, but like you said, very educational.
Yeah, it was funny because that was in the year, was like 1999. And so the way that they ended up beating me to is they ran a third-party candidate who was also an undergraduate student.
Oh.
And so they literally siphoned just enough votes away from me. And the reason I bring that up is because in a year later, we saw the 2000 election. And in the 2000 election, Al Gore had a similar sort of situation where he lost Florida because of Ralph Nader, and that's, pulled just enough votes away where he ended up losing that election. And so it's just interesting to see that as a strategy that sometimes people use, but it's also was frustrating to feel that personally and then unfortunately see that happen at the national level. So when you talk about that experience, it gives you a really good idea of how to kind of handle situations. And we ended up having a recount in my election. And so that actually prepared me because then my senior year was doing a lot of work on campaigns and stuff. And so prepared me for how to do a recount then.
What would you say were your main policy positions or your 3 talking points maybe when you were running for city council?
I mean, it's similar to here with kind of the city of Minneapolis and the University of Minnesota. I mean, in Wisconsin, Madison's a much smaller town though, but it's really about making sure student voices were being represented in the city. So we were just such a huge part of the economy, but often it was those student voices being left out because administrators would have their voice, faculty and staff would have their voice as sort of voters, but students really left out. And so with that was really being a voice for students and making sure that city policies were sort of bringing that perspective sort of forward. So a lot about like transportation issues. So particularly in Madison, it's on an isthmus. So it's actually very hard to sort of find housing close to campus. So a lot of students have to use transportation as part of that. And so having a really reliable transportation system, and then also the student government would negotiate with the city and actually get a bus pass. You all have that sort of similar. In Madison, we'd had that for years, and so that was always a priority for me, is to make sure that was sort of done in a fair and economical way. And then issues like campus safety, so not that dissimilar to issues you all are dealing with, particularly alcohol issues were sometimes a challenge. And so making sure the police and the students had good relationships and it wasn't super confrontational and aggressive, because we had some episodes where that was happening pretty regularly. And so I think those were kind of the primary sort of pieces then too.
Yeah, just the bread and butter issues for any college student. That's interesting. I didn't know that about you going into this interview, that you ran for city council at the age of 19, because I'm assuming you just have to be 18 to run in Wisconsin.
Yeah. So, every place, most places you have to be 18. There are a few places actually they've lowered the voting age. So in Maryland, where we were out a few months ago, they actually have some municipalities out there that have lowered the voting age to 16. So in those type of places, you could run if you were 16, but you have to be eligible to vote, essentially, is always the requirement. So
that's interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes more and more popular with more and more people wanting younger representation. It's
something that I long-term want to work on. So actually that's kind of how I really got my start, is when I was 16 years old at Stillwater. I had free time available, and so I worked with some legislators, and we were trying to pass a bill to lower the voting age in Minnesota. So this was way back in like 1994, and with that, we actually got really far. So I've just built a coalition with other students from across the state, and we got that passed through the House and the Senate, and Governor Arne Carlson ended up vetoing it. So we would have been one of the first states that had ever passed that, but unfortunately he vetoed it. And they've tried to bring it back every so often, but I think it has a shot here coming up in the next few years to lower the voting age. And I mean, my thing at the time was like, you drive a car, you can basically be tried for murder as an adult. You're often paying taxes. It was essentially no taxation without representation. And so feeling that young people should have the right to vote at that age. And then also, I think it also promotes civic engagement. And so it's an opportunity to kind of get people engaged earlier on, where you actually have a voice in the process. And that, I think, would help just increase overall civic engagement through your life, is if you can do that earlier when you're in that sort of high school setting. I think that would really set folks up for success and actually deal with some of the apathy that sometimes exists kind of throughout.
For sure. I know that's one of the things that I'm very interested in, is just having younger people become more civically knowledgeable about certain things. I know when I was in high school, you could take civics when you're a senior, but it'd be really nice if you could take that maybe one time in middle school and then maybe all 4 years of high school if you're able to, because it's such an important thing to know. And I don't think people appreciate how much power voting has, and it's a shame that you see such low voter turnout for people my age. And when they do turn out, they can really make a difference. So I think that you might be onto something there with just having people become more civically engaged by lowering that voting age.
Yeah, and I really see voting as kind of that gateway in. Because that's often people's first step to really being civically engaged. And then you have to create those opportunities beyond that then too. And so learning how bills become law, I think, is super important. And like you talked about power, I think is really something that's critical, that you as a voter have tremendous power with this situation, but I don't think people fully understand that. And so understanding how you can change policy, I think, can be a very powerful activity. And if we can help young people understand that earlier, I think they're more likely to be engaged. And particularly that's the role of, I would say, high schools. It's the role of our education system, is to train people to be engaged, active citizens. And I think we've unfortunately gone through a period of time here where high school, elementary level, secondary level, just is not doing a very good job of that right now. And I think we're seeing, unfortunately, the fruits of that sort of lack of engagement around that issue.
Yeah, I think it's that paired with a little bit of just the toxicity within the political climate right now. I know a lot of people my age that I know are just tuning out all the noise that's being made, and I don't blame them. I mean, I know also when you talk about voting, getting you that gateway into that whole realm of the political world. I know when I first voted in the general election this past 2024 election, it was a little daunting because you just, it's the first time voting. You're registered to vote. You're trying to figure out where your precinct is, make sure you show up at the right time. And for me being a political science student, I'm all for this. But it wasn't that much work, but probably more than most people would be willing to put in, especially if they aren't a bunch of nerds about it like you and me are when it comes to it too. But I think also I remember being in elementary school and just having that like that kids election that you could have.
Yep.
I remember 2012 Mitt Romney versus Obama. I remember casting my ballot in that at my local elementary school, and that just, once you get that foot in the door, it really just opens up so many other interests and knowledge ways for people to vote.
Well, and I think that's why civics is so critical sort of in the high schools then too, because if you get exposure that at a younger age, you become much more comfortable sort of with that. I mean, I think Kids Voting is a great program that exists in Minnesota, and a huge number of students participated this year, but it got them sort of to understand here's how the process works in a safe sort of environment for them, and I think that will help them be more successful. Because I think the challenge is when you turn 18, you don't magically like sprinkle pixie dust on people and they become engaged citizens. It's a learned activity, and if we're not teaching folks how to do that, they're not going to be engaged.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you mentioned, I know you're also very interested in higher education advocacy, and I'm just curious on how you became involved in that field of advocacy, and it's very important nowadays, whether it's with student loan forgiveness or just more affordability. So could you just tell me about how you became involved in higher education advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the advocacy really for me started when I was in high school and started coming up to the Capitol and lobbying and got to testify and kind of see the impact I could have in that process. So then when I went to college, it was kind of a continuation of that. And then after I ran for city council and lost, I didn't just like stop and say, all right, I'm never doing politics again. It was an opportunity for me to get even more engaged. And so that year, then I ran for president, essentially, of the student government. And that's really where I started to get involved more in higher ed policy, because there at the University of Wisconsin, we would go up to the Wisconsin State Capitol and really advocate to make college more affordable, fight for things like textbook costs and dealing with those issues. That got my kind of initial sort of engagement on it. And then, went out and worked in D.C. for a little bit and then came back and started working with the University of Minnesota. So I actually was here on staff working in the government relations department along with the alumni department. And part of my role there was to really help mobilize students, faculty, staff to support the University of Minnesota's legislative agenda. And so that really gave me a good education to higher ed policy because I got to learn from the rest of the staff. I think at the time I was probably in my 20s. That was really my third job out of college. And that was just a phenomenal experience to really sort of understand how that worked. And particularly at that time, the University of Minnesota Government Relations team was not only working to try to get more funding for the U, but we were also trying to get funding for the Gopher football stadium. And so that was particularly something that just kind of plopped in my lap because at the time you had a donor who came forward to the university and said, hey, I want to pay for bringing Gopher football home and putting it on campus. And so the university ramped up, started running this effort and starting to plan for it. And then unfortunately the negotiations fell apart and they didn't have somebody to fund it. So now you have all this effort, all this excitement to bring Gopher football back onto campus, but no way to pay for it. So then we quickly sort of pivoted to doing a legislative advocacy strategy at the Capitol and really putting pressure on legislators to help fund it, along with then students are funding it through your student fees as part of that proposal. And so we were able to generate over 15,000 letters to elected officials in just a short period of time. And because of that pressure, that grassroots pressure, we were able to move from what was essentially third place to first place. And the place, at the same time, not only was the University of Minnesota asking for a new football stadium, but so were the Twins and so were the Vikings. And so because of their powerful lobbying arm, they were in front. but we were able to put up this huge grassroots pressure where we were the sort of leapfrog them, and we quickly became sort of the leading candidate. And then a few years later, the state funded it for Gopher football, and now you all get to enjoy that as part of it. And so that was kind of the experience that really got me into higher ed policy. And then shortly thereafter, I started my own consulting firm, where then I worked with higher ed institutions around the country, and then to help them build up these sort of grassroots efforts to really build public support for their higher ed agenda. Because at the time, you saw a decrease in funding for higher education across the country. And so part of what my sort of pitch to them is that if you can get that public support for it and really get buy-in from your internal and external communities, you're able to put pressure on elected officials to fund higher ed at a better rate. And so worked with clients around the country. And so had, phenomenal experience sort of doing that.
Yeah, well, on behalf of the student body here, thank you for your work on getting us to stadium. I know we certainly enjoyed coming the fall. It's a very fun time, and I know the intramural football teams love going out and playing flag football out there. So yeah, that's a great little feather in your cap right there to have for someone that is in your line of work. I'm interested on what your philosophy is on creating a very effective grassroots campaign. I know a lot of people hear that grassroots, and how I know like Bernie Sanders is big on that. AOC, I believe, when she won the Democratic nominee for her congressional district, is big on that. So what is, you talked about getting the internal and external, people united behind something. What else goes into that grassroots effort?
Yeah, and so with any sort of advocacy effort, there's probably three legs of the stool. There's what's called the direct lobbying, which is where you have lobbyists going and talking to elected officials and really sort of educating them. That's an important part. That's one leg of the stool. The other, I would say, is that sort of grassroots advocacy. And so it's kind of average members of the public sending messages to elected officials, raising issues with them, potentially volunteering on their campaigns, donating, and sending those letters that can really sort of have a positive impact. And then the third is really what I call media relations and sort of public engagement. And all three legs of that stool are just critical to the success of any sort of advocacy effort. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of folks just focus on one or two of those legs. And to be truly successful, you need those sort of three components. And I think the hardest, because it's really about people power, is that sort of grassroots advocacy. And that's really about just talking to people. And so when it comes to like the Gopher football example, I mean, we went out and literally talked to people as they're entering Gopher football games. And so we would essentially have petitions out there where people would sign letters and send that in to them. We also put up on a lot of the Gopher football sort of message boards information about sort of the advocacy effort. And we also encourage people to talk to friends and family. And it was because of that sheer volume of letters that was going in that really sort of piqued legislators' interest in it and really put pressure sort of on them. There's a quote that I love sort of about this, and I think it was former Georgia Senator Russell said, when I feel the heat, I see the light. Essentially meaning is when you have that sort of grassroots pressure, that really encourages elected officials to sort of do the right thing. And I think we've kind of lost our way on some of those pieces, is that we don't always think about what are we doing to really engage the broader community to sort of put pressure on. And we often just try to run direct lobbying efforts or these media relations campaign through the news. And that sometimes just is not enough to kind of get it over the sort of hump on this. And that's why I think the grassroots advocacy is key. And I think you've seen that with the presidential campaigns. I think you see that with, I would argue, efforts here at the University of Minnesota. I think they aren't doing that sort of grassroots advocacy anymore. And I think they're really struggling to sort of make the case at the Capitol because they've abandoned, I think, what is a key strategy to building public support for issues.
Yeah, and you talk about how you get that volume, that heat that's get brought on to those lawmakers, and they see the light. Well, if you don't have people that are civically engaged or just don't care about civic engagement, how are they supposed to feel the heat then and therefore see the light? So it just all kind of comes back just being civically engaged. That seems like, from what you're saying too, it is like a big component of it, especially when it comes to grassroots efforts.
And it's been tougher here lately in the sort of post-COVID world. People just don't join organizations like they used to. And then I think this has been sort of a trend that's happening, but it's gotten particularly worse in the sort of post-COVID world. And I think that's part of the dysfunction that we see in our politics, is because people don't understand how government works. People don't necessarily know how to really engage and talk to their neighbors as much. We're doing everything through social media. And so, I'm really trying to think about how do we sort of bring people back to this? How do they join organizations, work with community members to solve problems together? Sometimes this can be through politics. Sometimes that's just doing the work. But creating those spaces where we can do that, I think, is a way that we can really sort of deal with the dysfunction that's going on.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with the effects of social media paired with COVID-19 pandemic. And that's a nasty storm that those two create when they're put together. And then you can get certain people having signs that say, "Government, get your hands off my Social Security," or it's just like, come on. Like, this is just, if you're civically engaged, that's a foolish thing to say. But it's no fault of their own if they don't know. So you got to be empathetic at the same time too.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the challenge with kind of how folks move forward sort of post-election. I think there can be a lot of frustration with, oh, well, you're getting what you deserve, whether it's sort of some of the raids that are happening or tariffs that are happening. I think we have to bring empathy to the situation and understand that I think we as kind of a society have sort of failed folks to really help them understand how government works, how these things sort of engage, and can't just punish them and say, well, now you have to sort of sit in this bed you've created. It's really about what are we doing to help people sort of understand the challenges that are being created, and bring that empathy to the situation and sort of engage and educate them sort of about this work.
Absolutely. One of the big things you've been involved in with higher education advocacy is the North Star Promise program. So would you mind explaining what that is and why it's a historic leap forward in college affordability?
Yeah, so the North Star Promise is essentially free college for Minnesota families that have an income below $80,000. So the requirement is you have to be a Minnesota resident. You have to go to any of the public community colleges or state universities or any of the University of Minnesota campuses, and then any of the tribal colleges. And so with that, then, as long as you meet those two criteria, maintain a academic performance above 2.0, meaning your kind of satisfactory academic progress, you will get then college paid for free. So it covers all your tuition, it covers your fees. It doesn't cover books or room and board as part of that. But for a lot of students, it makes just a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I've been passionate about for years. And when I was previously at an organization called Lead MN, we sort of led the fight on this, and it started 8 years ago. And part of it is just my personal experience with this. I mean, so when I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, my parents couldn't afford to pay for school for me. So I had to figure out how to pay for it myself. I was fortunate in that I was able to sort of launch my own business, and basically the summers I would do landscaping, and that would make enough money for me where I could pay for school. I worked really hard those summers, but I was able to do that. Students today work just as hard as I do. Oftentimes they have 1, 2, 3 jobs, and they're still graduating with significant debt. And I think that's just fundamentally a problem. It's because we've undervalued education, and we've decided to balance state budgets on the backs of students. And so it was really important for me to let's make sure we can have those opportunities for folks and make college more affordable. And so we've seen just the results of the North Star Promise, which just this fall being the first year it was implemented, where a dramatic increase in students have come back to college, where statewide we've seen an increase of about 6.2% in enrollment overall. Here at the U, it's about 7%. Minnesota State, it's around 8%. And we're just seeing a positive impact on that. And the case we made at the legislature on this is that we need to prepare our future workforce. And sort of we are not helping young people go to college, graduate on time, graduate without a ton of debt. That is critical for the state's economy, because those folks become teachers, they become nurses, they become business folks in our communities. And so if they're not getting that education, they're not moving to those roles. They're moving to other roles that more sort of service type of roles. And if the state is, Minnesota tends to have a really high proportion of people with those degrees, but we've been pricing them out. And so if we want to sort of maintain that high level, we really need to help more young people go into and get their bachelor's degree. And it's not just bachelor's degrees though too, it's any sort of post high school education, because Georgetown University did a study that said 3 out of 4 jobs in Minnesota by the year 2025, so this year, are going to require some sort of post-high school degree. And so right now, I think we're at about 65%, and so we have a gap right now. Mm-hmm. And my other worry is what's happening to those businesses in Minnesota. So if they can't find the workers they need, are they going to stay here? They're not staying here because of the weather, right? And so, if they can't find those employees, they're going to go elsewhere. Mm. And so it's so critical for us to invest in that and make sure that we're getting more of those people those degrees.
Absolutely. When you were first proposing this at the legislature, what were some original challenges that you ran into over those 8 years that it took to get it implemented?
I think there's a few sort of pieces of pushback on it. One was going to be the cost. So initial estimates that this would cost, $500 million. And so that was overly exaggerated. So I think that was one piece. I think the second piece is people would say, well, if a student has college paid for, they don't really have skin in the game. And I think that's just such a fallacy, because the skin in the game, many students have free college already. Many of our student athletes are here on full rides. Mm-hmm. And many of them are committed to not only their athletic programs, but then also to getting that degree because they know the value of that degree. And the skin in the game is you have to work for your degree. They don't just hand out degrees to anyone. You have to study, you have to go to class, you have to be sort of engaged on campus. And so I felt that was such a fallacy and so frustrating, because students I know work really hard and often struggle to sort of balance both going to class and working a job. If anything, I would say forcing students to take on more jobs, harms their academics and actually delays their education. And so, quite honestly, we should make college free, honestly, I think, for everyone, just like what we do with K-12. And so that has helped boost educational attainment in this country when we made that decision in the early 20th century. And I think now here in the 21st century, we need to do the same thing for post-secondary education, because that's what our economy demands. And when you take that burden off of college or paying for college, it just really sort of helps them focus on what they need to, which is their studies as part of it. So those are the main two pushbacks that we saw with the program.
So this North Star Promise program is almost maybe a way to get the public exposed to this sort of idea of college becoming more and more affordable and therefore free for some people, like you said, and maybe hopefully someday implementing just universal higher education, whether it's just for 4 years, or would that even cover like people going to get their masters or their PhDs, or would it just be the 4-year for undergraduate or 2-year trade school?
Personally, right now, I think where we are as a country, I think the focus on to help them get that sort of undergraduate degree or a 2-year certificate or some sort of post-high school degree, I think that should be free. I think the piece is, I don't know if we're quite there when it comes to more advanced degrees. I think the argument can be made is that the investment that you make in that, let's say you're going to be a lawyer, most of the time you're able to reap that investment back. Doctors, definitely sort of the case there, mm-hmm. where they're able to sort of reap that investment back. So I don't know if we're quite there yet, but I think for at least the sort of bachelor's degree community, I think long-term we need to make that free for everyone, regardless of income. Because again, the state is going to reap that investment with having those advanced degrees. Those people are more likely to then work and have higher paying jobs, and thus they're paying more taxes back into it, and that helps sort of keep this sort of cycle going as part of it. But we might get to a place where some of those advanced degrees are paid for. I know a lot of rural areas are having a hard time finding doctors, and one of the main reasons is that general practitioner in some of these rural areas, they just don't pay a lot. And so they're borrowing $200,000-$300,000 for a medical degree, and then you expect them to only make a certain amount in a rural area, they just can't attract that. So I think there's some places where there's reverse incentives, and maybe in those places, I think it would make sense for us to sort of make that more affordable for those individuals.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective to hold. I never really thought of it that way with the urban-rural divide and that discrepancy that could be created, especially in, like, I was not mistaken, northern Minnesota, like super far north. That's a huge issue for people. Like the ambulance response times are just not where they should be. And that goes from just, how vast, like it's very sparsely populated area too, but then also there's just not as much taxes being paid, and therefore you can't fund those those public infrastructure projects like a hospital and maybe the roads too that help get those ambulances to where they're supposed to be, and therefore you don't get that higher pay and don't attract those better doctors that you're going to have. So that's interesting too. I also was thinking as well as if you implement this education policy where it could be paid for in Minnesota. Let's say you graduate from a Minnesota university. Well, that'd probably make you, if you want to raise a family, probably be another incentive to stay too. If your kids could go and get high quality education for a very affordable price, that could just keep that cycle going, and that more tax dollars get reaped to the state too. And who knows what could come out of that as well.
Yeah, because normally when people go to a college here, they stay here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the other reasons why we did the North Star Promise program, was to try to retain more of our young people, because Minnesota actually traditionally has been a net exporter of young people, meaning we're sending them to other states to get an education. And so by bringing that here, we're able to keep more, and then they're likely to stay here. And that obviously helps build a better sort of workforce in the state, and really helps sort of create a diversified business environment for the state then too.
And the program was first implemented this last fall, you said, but is it funded for like 3 years? I read somewhere. When would that funding be due again?
So technically the funding is up this legislative session.
Okay.
So the way the budget works is there's what's called a biennial budget. So that's every 2 years. And so this last budget began in June of 2023 and ends, in July of 2023, and this cycle ends in June here of 2025. So new budget starts up then this July here. And so that's what the legislature is meeting right now, is that they have to sort of, before the budget starts on July 1st, they have to have a new budget for the state adopted by then. If not, we go into government shutdown mode.
Yeah, and that's happened, was it 2010 or something like that?
It's happened, unfortunately, a number of times here with sort of the dysfunction of the legislature, where they've been unable to sort of have agreements. But I'm optimistic that does not happen this year.
Yeah, knock on wood. We'll see what happens with that. Within the North Star Promise program, I also saw that the funding isn't extended towards private institutions. Could you explain why that is?
Yeah, I think for a few reasons. I mean, one is private colleges don't face the same sort of oversight that they do here for the University of Minnesota or for Minnesota State. And what you particularly see is just a huge increase in tuition. I mean, tuition in a private institution is sometimes 4 or 5 times more. And so you don't have that sort of same oversight. And so what we wanted to do is really focus on incentivizing students to go to the public institutions. The state has decided that's a responsibility that's taken on. It's going to fund those. And so we want to encourage students to sort of go to those type of institutions. If you want to go to a private institution, that's great. You just have to pay for it on your own dime as part of it. And particularly, we've underfunded, I would argue, our public higher education system. And so I think there's a desire to not want to send more dollars sort of elsewhere as part of that. That's not to say that those institutions don't provide huge value to the state, particularly in educating individuals, but it's more for folks that kind of afford those sort of options as part of that. And so really, our first priority needs to be on our public institutions. And then once we've done that, then I think we can look at supporting other types of institutions. So the private colleges have made a case to try to fund them. But I just don't think we're there. The state does not have enough money right now to do that. And so unless the state were to decide to fund higher education at a much higher level, I just don't see us sort of getting to that level right now.
Yeah. Unfortunately, this is kind of how it goes, especially when you roll out such a monumental program like that. It's going to be hard to just include everyone under that umbrella. And
it's not that different than what we do at the elementary education level then too, right? So if you go to any public high school in the state, that is free. Maybe there's some fees you have to pay, but if you choose to go to a private institution, that is not free. And so that's we see that sort of play out also at the secondary level then.
Yeah, I guess that's a good counter argument to those that would argue why it doesn't include private colleges as well. When you were first lobbying for this, or maybe now as you're trying to get it refunded again, how do you approach the short-term political pressures of this program and then to pair them with the long-term policy outcomes? I would assume there's a lot of people in the legislature that are worried about the cost of it too, or people that just want less government involved in certain institutions. How do you go about explaining why it's an incentive to fund this fully?
I mean, the great thing about this is we now have kind of a year sort of under our belt. So that helps us see the impact. It also helps us see the cost. So the great thing about this then is that it only costs $45 million annually now. And when you look at the bigger state budget picture, that's not that much at all. And then for the return on the investment that we're seeing, it's been huge, where it's really attracted a lot more students back to the table. So, I think there are concerns that some folks may try to go after the program. I think it's just that would be such bad policy, because if we were to try to get rid of it at this point, I think it would have a devastating impact on some of these colleges, particularly in rural areas that have been struggling up until this point for enrollment. And I think we're in serious danger of potentially having to shut down because there's just not enough students to do that. We're expecting in the next decade that a number of higher ed institutions, both in Minnesota, but definitely nationally, are going to have to shut down because enrollment just isn't going to be there. And so the North Star Promise program, I think, has helped attract more people in, and that is sort of keeping those institutions above water where they can continue to exist. And in some of these greater Minnesota communities, this is the heart of the community. If you don't have that college, you lose the jobs, but then you also lose the opportunity in the pipeline to really build up a workforce in those areas. Because what I think greater Minnesota cities have seen is that if a student then leaves to come down here to the cities for college, they're probably not coming back. They're probably going to stay here. And so if you have these institutions in greater Minnesota, you're much more likely to sort of retain that sort of workforce locally. And I know they've definitely seen that in places like Pine Tech, where you actually have a local bank that has actually created a free college program before we ever created North Star. And it was particularly for this, of retaining more of those young people in the community to stay there. And so I think because of that, I just don't think we're going to go backwards at all on this. And so it's really about how do we continue to make these investments, and quite honestly, I want to think about how do we expand the program to have the greatest impact sort of possible for Minnesotans.
Yeah, I know having entered at this state senate this last year, sitting on these committee hearings, the state senators certainly do like those data points that you can point to. And that obviously you couldn't do that when the program didn't exist. But now that you got a year under your belt and you get the positive data that's coming in about enrollment being increased, certainly going to put the heat on them a little more, and maybe they'll see the light quicker. So I think, yeah, like you said, that's something I hope is implemented further, and it seems like it's got a pretty good shot, even though the whole political landscape in the state government right now is very unique position that it's at right now.
And I think the other piece of working on is also telling stories. So I'm going to be working to bring students up to kind of talk about, how the North Star Promise program has had a positive impact on them. How, if they didn't have this, some of them might not have gone to college. They might have gone elsewhere. And so having legislators hear those personal stories along with the data points really can be persuasive.
Another thing I saw on the North Star Promise website was this North Star Promise Plus Award. Could you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the idea with this is to really provide additional supports for students beyond just paying for tuition and fees, understanding that students have a whole host of costs when they're going to college. And so it's really to kind of help provide that. And so the way the program works is that it can match up to 50% of a student's Pell Grant. So the other beauty of that aspect is it allowed the North Star Promise program to distribute the money more equally among the different income groups. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, when you implement what's called the last dollar program, which means that the scholarship only is triggered until other scholarships are paid out. So a student can get a federal Pell Grant, then they get some state financial aid as part of that. There might be some institutional aid, and then North Star Promise comes in. When we have these programs, they tend to benefit more those higher income individuals. So this would have been students in $50,000 to $80,000. We wanted to make sure that money was more equally distributed between the different incomes of students. And so with this, then it created sort of a minimum award, particularly that you saw what those lower income students ended up receiving. And so as a result of that, the Office of Higher Education shared this week that almost 45,000 students have received some sort of North Star Plus award as part of that. So the average grant, I think, was like $300. For those students, it's making a huge difference. That pays for them books for some of them. Some of them did get more. I know some students that get up to $900. So that covers all their books for sure for both semesters. And so it helps deal with some of those other costs that don't necessarily show up on the tuition bill that sometimes is a barrier for a student. And so that's why we wanted to build that in. And we're seeing, I think, a really positive impact. And I think the students are sort of appreciating that. That, though, is just a pilot project. So that only exists for 3 years. So that money will run out here after the next biennium. So this will be after 2027. And so we use some of the surplus money really from last year to help sort of pay for that program. And so I think we'll see that it has a positive impact. And then at that point, we'll make the case that we need to sort of continue that investment.
Yeah, and I also saw that another big piece for you guys is trying to implement universal FAFSA within, I don't know if it was just Minnesota or just nationally too. But it seems like the upside to that, especially with the way the program's structured and how it fills in that money that's not covered by these Pell Grants or whatever other scholarships that students might receive. Could you just explain why Universal FAFSA would benefit the North Star Promise program and young people in general?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges right now with the North Star Promise program is that in order to qualify for the money, you first have to fill out a FAFSA. But the FAFSA itself, particularly after all the problems we saw this past year, has been a barrier. And so what we want to really do is encourage more Minnesota high schools to take on the responsibility of supporting students in completing that federal application for financial aid, because that can mean thousands of dollars for students and often can be how they decide whether they go to college or not. But for so many students, that FAFSA is a barrier. And so we really want to encourage that. And other states have implemented this program, have seen dramatic increases in FAFSA completion rates. So Minnesota, if you look at last year, we had roughly only 50% of graduating high school seniors filled out a FAFSA. Some of them didn't fill it out because they thought they wouldn't qualify for any aid because they thought their parents made too much money. But we've actually worked with some federal partners and actually found out that Minnesota is on average losing about $20 million, meaning if students had filled out their FAFSA, they actually would have gotten aid. And so that is money that could have made college a lot more affordable. And so what Universal FAFSA does is it embeds that into the graduation process and kind of helps then the students transition as you're thinking about graduating from high school. Your next step is potentially going to college, trade school, university, whatever it is, and this will then help you fill out the FAFSA then to qualify for aid to sort of pay for that path then as part of that. And so helping them understand then that college doesn't have to be super expensive, that you can actually get this sort of aid to really sort of reduce the price, then has a positive impact on encouraging them to go. And as other states have implemented that, they've not only seen that obviously the FAFSA completion rates go up, like Tennessee is at like 75%, but then it's also helped more people going to college. And that's fundamentally what we want to try to do more of.
Yeah, and it seems like that's kind of killing two birds with one stone for those that are trying to qualify for the North Star Promise program. If it's already required for you to graduate high school, well, then you automatically could be enrolled if you are under that threshold of the $80,000 then. And like you said, the more money they can hand out. It seems like they love throwing out money when it comes to these Pell Grants or just FAFSA in general. So, yeah, it's certainly going to help people, especially with how prices are rising, it seems like, for many institutions within the state, and as you said, nationally too. I mean, if you have less people enrolled, then to stay afloat, you're going to have to raise prices to just keep everything funded. So, yeah, it seems like a good idea to implement that idea along the way. What has been the marketing strategy for these programs so far for you guys?
Around North Star Promise specifically, or?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the state of Minnesota is doing some promotion around it. I've argued that there just hasn't been enough. I mean, it's a brand new program, so we're still seeing just a lot of lack of awareness of it. One of the things that North Star Prosperity, my organization, did this past year is we sent out some direct mail pieces to graduating high school seniors to try to get them more aware of the program. And I think it's really critical to think about how you market this to young people. And I think some of the marketing that the state was doing just was not effective because it was about go to college because it's going to boost enrollment. Well, that's doing nothing to talk to the individual on why they should decide to shell out money to go to college. And so it really needs to be about what's going to motivate young people to want to sort of make this decision to go to college. And that's kind of where we really focus our efforts, and is really about, helping you think about your long-term earnings. And so they estimate that, somebody going to getting a 2-year or 4-year degree makes on average $1 million more than those that do not. And so there's a huge return on investment, but I don't think a lot of people know about that. So we really work to kind of educate them about that, to show them that this is a worthwhile investment and you get the value out of it.
Yeah, I like I said, I agree with everything that you're doing with this program, and it seems like the marketing aspect too is, if you have a great program and no one knows about it, then what good is it really doing? So yeah, definitely marketing is a huge part of that 3 legs that you're talking about too.
And part of it is that there's multiple paths, though, to success. I think over the last 2 decades, there's been a lot of focus just on university as a pathway. And what's great about this program is that you could go get some sort of certificate that you could get at a community college that sort of helps boost your potential earnings, or you could just get an associate's degree as part of that. And so we're presenting them with multiple pathways, because in many regards, some of those trade programs you can do just as well as a business professional. I mean, some plumbers can make $80,000 to $100,000, and so those are decent salaries for them. And so I think that's the other part of this too, is just giving people multiple options, and then you get to sort of choose the path that makes the most sense for you.
Absolutely. You talked a little bit about media relations and how that's an important part of what you do. Could you just explain how that's your skill in that field has grown over your career?
Yeah, I think the challenge, though, in this environment, I think is becoming less valuable, unfortunately. When I was just starting out, 20 plus years ago, media relations was just a necessary skill because people consume most of their information through traditional sort of news sources, whether that's radio, whether that's television news, whether that's the newspaper. I think in this sort of internet world that we live in, the media environment's so disaggregated that it's becoming less and less effective. And people now are using things like podcasts, TikTok, and others as kind of a way to get it out. What I think, though, media relations has sort of helped me is really think about how do you engage an audience to really sort of attract them to kind of what's going on. And so for me, I was able to start out early on in my career to really work with a media relations firm and sort of learn those skills early on. And that helped me then start to understand, how you pitch stories to reporters, how you kind of make the process easier for them to kind of take the story and sort of run with it, understanding that reporters, are filing a story a day. And so they can't be an expert in everything, and they're going to rely on you to sort of provide that information and sort of be a really useful source for them. So I'm always sort of taking potential story ideas, looking at what's going on in the broader news cycle, and then trying to package that and share that with reporters. And so have had a lot of success with it, where, at North Star, we had probably over 100 media hits in this last year. I think over my lifetime, probably been in the newspaper, TV news over 500 times on various issues. And so realizing that that's critical, but also I think, you have to develop sort of new skills where now you're your own sort of media entity, and how do you get that information out too?
Yeah, I think we're really in the transitional period. I mean, we saw this with the last election and how big of a role non-traditional media played in getting Donald Trump's message out in particular, whether he went on Joe Rogan, Theo Von, Nelk Boys podcast, among other examples. And that the reach that they have right now is really something that's just kind of dominating over traditional media, it seems like. I saw something where it was like, if Kamala Harris would have gone on like Morning Joe, she'd have to go on like at the prime time on MSNBC 5 times a week to get like half the exposure that Donald Trump got in 3 hours of Joe Rogan or something. Like, it's just insane how much reach you can have. So it'll be interesting to see how that field of media relations changes over these next 5-10 years, because I'm definitely going to be seeing some change in that field, I would assume.
Well, and especially for politicians then too, is I think in some of these programs people are interested of how do you talk about politics without talking about politics. And I think that's something that you see on Joe Rogan's show, and some of these other more conservative or right-leaning groups have done a phenomenal job of sort of building an audience around it. sort of post-election, I kind of went down a whole rabbit hole, and I'm just concerned about the state of the economy. So started kind of doing more investing and sort of searching for videos via YouTube, and there is just a whole community out there of groups kind of talking about investing, but bringing sort of this very conservative, rightward sort of lens. And I think that's something that progressives need to sort of think about: is how do you provide that value add, but then also how do you sort of create an environment where you're talking about politics though without talking about it.
Yeah, that's certainly a skill in and of itself. What goes into creating an effective and persuasive message for public policy projects or initiatives, and do you have a set philosophy for this, or does it depend on a case-by-case basis?
I mean, I think the challenge these days is when you're doing this type of work, you will bring assumptions to the table. And one of the things that I've tried to do, particularly when I have resources, is just testing these messages. And so I think in order to be effective at some of this, you can have those natural skills or sort of build them up over the years, but you also just have to ask people. And so with a lot of the political messaging that I've been working on developing, other sort of messaging is that we really try to do sometimes focus groups. We rely on different sort of poll testing as part of it to really help provide some overall guidance in terms of what resonates with people and what sort of does not these days. I think the challenge is that costs money, but for me, that's money sort of well invested.
Yeah. And would you think, I guess polling, I don't know really too much about the polling data from this past election, but I know the previous concern was that polling data wasn't very accurate in 2020 or 2016. When it came to the presidential election, is that a concern for you and you get a lot of value out of those polls?
And I think it depends on what type of polling you're sort of talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what I have found most helpful is taking different messages and then sort of asking people what do they think is sort of more persuasive or sort of effective, and getting a diverse group of input on. I think when it comes to the political horse races, I think that's super difficult to sort of poll on these days because you just don't know who the electorate's sort of going to be. And I think particularly with Donald Trump, we've seen just the electorate be a very different universe than it has been during sort of traditional elections. And so, I think, yes, horse race polls, not super helpful. What is helpful, though, is kind of helping folks, or talking to folks and kind of identifying what sort of messages work and what don't work. And I think that was one of the missed things from this election was people really were focused on the economy. Mm-hmm. And I just don't know if the sort of Harris campaign did enough to really sort of talk about that particular issue, that the message was divided in three ways around democracy, pro-choice, and the economy. And as a result of that, I don't think then the economic messages sort of really sort of resonated enough with folks.
So you think that's the main reason behind Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 election?
Yeah, it was the economy stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the old James Carville comment from the 92 election. And I think that's what we saw sort of this time around too, that I think people were frustrated with runaway inflation. And they didn't see the Biden administration doing enough on that. And then I think Kamala wasn't able to distance herself enough from what Biden was able to do on that. The fact of the matter is, I think over the next few years, they're going to see things get much worse and realize that you can't just punish the incumbent. You have to sort of look at the other person and kind of what their plans are. And I struggle to see what was President Trump's plan to deal with inflation. And in fact, I think you've heard here recently, he basically said, I'm not going to be able to lower grocery prices, even though he promised that sort of repeatedly. And I think fundamentally we're going to see actually grocery prices go up here, particularly with things like tariffs and others. And so I think this will be a good lesson learned for folks sort of on that. And I think it will be important for organizations like mine is to hold President Trump accountable on this. I mean, you said this, and here egg prices are going through the roof right now. Mm-hmm. And then also tying into actions that he's taking where, I would argue he's not taking bird flu very seriously right now. And so I think my concern is that bird flu is going to get significantly worse. That's going to send egg prices up significantly. But then what happens if this becomes another pandemic? And so we're going to have two pandemics under the same person. And I'm sorry, that's not a coincidence. It's because he makes decisions that sort of puts the public health sort of at risk. And I think the first one that he did was pulling out of the WHO. I mean, the World Health Organization provides a critical pulse on what's going on throughout the world in terms of these various diseases. If we're not monitoring it, if we're not staying engaged, if we're not collaborating with other countries, then we're going to be in a very bad spot. And I think that's what we're setting ourselves up for right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know they talk about bird flu, and in California, I believe they declared a state emergency to combat it. And I saw the New York Times headline just before we started recording here on how their egg prices are skyrocketing because poultry farmers had to kill thousands and thousands of chickens to prevent the spread of this disease. And it just takes one viral disease to spread to a human, and that starts mutating, and then we're back in 2020 all over again.
Yeah, and I think that's the big fear is that, I mean, right now it's just attacking sort of birds and it's impacting egg prices. I think the big fear is if this makes the jump to humans, and then are we dealing with a similar sort of COVID situation then too, because the mortality rate could be much higher than we saw with COVID. So bird flu has the potential to have a higher mortality rate, and I think then that obviously would be sort of devastating to folks.
Yeah, and I think, again, we're just coming back to the same point on how important just civic engagement is and just basic civic knowledge, too, because obviously if people just know how the government's structured, the president can't just wave a wand and then lower gas prices. I mean, you're tied into imports and exports and other things of that nature, too. And I just feel like some people think it's so black and white with these issues when it's quite gray for a lot of things. And the president has a lot of power and also doesn't have a lot of power for a lot of these things too. And then also when you go to the World Health Organization, pulling out of that, I mean, it's called the World Health Organization because it's for the entire globe. And if history's taught us anything, it's a lot of civilizations collapse from plagues or pandemics than they do. I mean, it's obviously war is another one than from other factors. I mean, that's the timeless nation killer is pandemics. So, yeah, when I saw that headline, I was a little concerned, to say the least.
And I think the big challenge is that it's unfortunately easy to feel helpless in this environment. That, all right, folks elected Donald Trump, now we're just going to have to sort of suck it up for 4 years. And I guess I want to start thinking about what are the small actions I can take to sort of fundamentally sort of change that culture that sort of exists. And so, bird flu I think is tough, but I'm thinking more about environmental sustainability when it comes to sort of food. So one of the small actions I'm taking right now is I'm deciding to just grow more of my own food in my own house. So not only using my garden, but also sort of experimenting with things like hydroponics. And so how do you do that? And that's much more environmentally friendly. You're using 96% less water than you would through sort of traditional farming. And then you're also not putting chemicals, pesticides on it then too. And literally, in your house, you have just grow lights, but then you're growing lettuce and things that you can just sort of pick off and eat. And it puts you closer to kind of the sort of food cycle that exists. So, I think with all this stuff with Trump, a lot of folks feel hopeless, but think about, are there individual or small actions you can take yourself to give yourself a little bit more control, but to also sort of change sort of the culture around this and deal with some of the frustrations, whether that's environmental degradation, whether that's a lack of sort of community like we've talked about here. What are we doing to put down our cell phones a little bit more and engage with folks and have conversations like we're having here today? Are there other sort of small steps that you can take to really sort of change this environment? And maybe that moves us a little bit farther away from this sort of path that we feel like we're careening towards right now of civilization essentially ending.
Yeah, right. And I know that's one of my things I'm really excited about when I see the increase of long-form conversations through podcasts. I mean, you look at the existence of Homo sapiens, and when we were able to communicate, it was more just oral communication and not bent over looking at a phone, swiping through 60-second videos that you see on TikTok, and the damage that does to your attention span. I know I was talking to some of my friends when TikTok got banned for that 24-hour period, whatever it was. One of my buddies, he said he accidentally logged into TikTok out of habit over 15 times during that 24 hours it was closed. I mean, people are 100% addicted to that app. And for me personally, I know there's a big argument to be had on the First Amendment issues that come to it. But when you look at the national security implications of TikTok too, not necessarily trying to steal your data, which is a problem in and of itself, but I just think people are, if you don't have an attention span for longer than 60 seconds, then think about the tricks the government can just pull right past you, and you have no idea whatsoever. And if the media doesn't cover it, how are you supposed to figure that out then?
Yeah, and so it comes back to what are you doing to develop real human relations then here going forward, and what do we do to make sure we're prioritizing that over sort of other pieces? And so, like, I think if folks feel like we're careening towards this sort of end of civilization, what steps can you take then to move us away from that? And I think it's things like that, putting down the cell phone and no longer just taking the government information that's being sort of fed or force-fed to you, because the algorithms are proven to just really sort of make us more negative, not trust each other, almost hate each other. And would that be different if you just put your cell phone down and had some conversations?
Right. Or just, maybe if someone doesn't have the same political ideology as you, you never know if you have a one-on-one conversation with them, you might have more in common than you would originally think, which is just comes back again to that just basic face-to-face conversation that people are hopefully would start coming back to more and more now, but we will see what happens with that. When it comes to 2024 election, what do you think the Democrats should have done differently when it came to that whole campaign that was run?
I think focus much more on the economy, because I think that's where people were frustrated with. And I think that they didn't do a good enough job really identifying who the villain was. And the villain, I think, was these monopolistic corporations that are going on. Just there's so much that corporations are doing that I think is having a negative impact, whether it's sort of feeding us all this information that is essentially garbage on TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, that I think that's problematic because it's all designed to sort of make you buy things, buy more crap, distrust more people. But it's not just that. I think it comes down to other things like stuff I fought against this year, and that's junk fees. And so corporations increasingly sort of use their tendencies to bolster their monopolies to really maximize their profits. And so things like junk fees are good examples. You go out to or you order something online for food, a delivery fee, and you think a hamburger costs $12, but when you get to the end, it actually costs $15 because they've added on all these sort of different fees, and there's a real lack of transparency sort of in that process. They'll even do things like algorithmic pricing, where as you're kind of going through the process, the price will just magically sort of increase. We see this with ticket prices all the time right now. Taylor Swift, that was a good example, but go to any concert these days, and the algorithms are just jacking up every single price on that. And so the whole idea is to squeeze as much dollars out of you as possible. And so I think that was the true villain in this election. And I think we as a society need to do more. And Donald Trump's message is that immigrants, trans people, LGBTQ plus are the problem in society. And Democrats didn't have a response to that. And I would argue it's actually these monopolistic corporations that are truly creating these problems. Until we start to sort of rein them in, your problems are going to get a whole lot worse here. And I think that's what we're going to see over the next few years here is, all right, so President Trump is going to deport a lot of people. Is my life going to get better as a result of that? And I think what we're going to see is no. And if anything, it's actually going to get a whole lot worse. And we're going to realize that these different communities that were villainized by President Trump were not the problems to begin with. And the true problems are the companies that he's protecting. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, those are the folks that are really the problems. And that's why we saw them there at Inauguration Day, is because his job now is to protect them and is not to protect you.
Do you agree with President Biden's farewell address and an oligarchy exists in the United States right now?
I actually define it differently. I call it a theocracy.
Theocracy.
And so basically it is that they are creating a government to exploit people's money from them to then benefit themselves. Mm-hmm. And you see this with Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump literally is using the government as his own piggy bank to enrich himself, enrich his family. He did that during the first term. Look at sort of Jared Kushner and what he was able to do with these massive sort of deals with Saudi Arabia. I mean, we're talking millions, if not billions of dollars were moved from the Saudi government to Jared Kushner's accounts as a result of that. And we're going to see that again. I mean, what is the president not hawking right now. I think I've seen watches, I've seen shoes, everything else. Cryptocurrency memes, I think, was the last thing here this week. And so everything is there to sort of benefit himself, and he is there to enrich himself. And so we are not in an oligarchy, we're in a thievocracy, and it's benefiting Donald Trump, it's benefiting Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and definitely Elon as part of that. And you have Elon making decisions about government contracts that he's the recipient of. And so, again, everything is being decided to benefit themselves. And so I think that's the fundamental problem right now. And I think we have to help people sort of understand this as a challenge where they're not doing this to benefit the United States. This isn't America first. It's me first is really their agenda.
Yeah. And I just come back to, obviously, like the things that you're talking about are going to be issues in the future here. But I look back on the election, I think it's not necessarily that Donald Trump won, it's Democrats lost, in the sense of Joe Biden goes out, has that terrible performance, and then all of a sudden you have people start coming out one by one and, oh yeah, we saw this decline coming, we saw this decline happen with him over the couple months, and it's like, I feel like Democrats really shot themselves in the foot, and then they didn't have necessarily the change candidate that a lot of the electorate wanted, with just having Vice President Kamala Harris, who did the best job that she could in that situation. I mean, that's literally you can't really succeed in that situation. But then the fact that she gets asked a very, an important question: what would you do differently from Joe Biden? Oh, nothing comes to mind. People with this were not very receptive to that. And then you think of all the baggage that comes with Donald Trump, with the fact that he's a convicted felon. Whether you agree with that decision or not, that's still a fact that he's a convicted felon, and all the things that he's done to women throughout his life too. And he's able to get reelected. And I don't know if that's because Americans aren't ready for a female president, whether it was Hillary Clinton 2016, Kamala Harris 2024, but I really think Democrats shot themselves in the foot with how the whole summer of the campaign turned out.
Well, and I think part of it is a lot of the focus was on democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're here to protect democracy. But I think fundamentally a lot of people feel like democracy is not working for them. But my question is, why is democracy not working for them? I would argue it's because of people like Mitch McConnell. And so they've used the government to basically undermine confidence in the government itself. Mitch McConnell has been one of the biggest opponents of any sort of campaign finance reform. And I think campaign finance reform has been critical, whether it's the Citizens United decision or anything else, to really put corporate power sort of at check. And so they decided we want corporations to basically give us money so we can get elected, and then we will do their bidding for them. And you saw that during the first sort of Trump administration. But I think the problem is that people feel government's not working for them right now. But the question is why? Is that because Joe Biden, or is that because Republicans have created a government that intentionally doesn't work for people, and that they sort of structured it that way? I mean, look what Mitch McConnell did throughout the years in which Obama was president. He said his number one goal was to make sure Obama didn't get a second term. And so he just tried to slow everything down. And I would argue really sort of weaken the economy because of that, because they did not implement critical stimulus that needed to happen after the financial collapse. And then also we never held the corporations accountable that really got us in that mess, partially because of Republicans in control. And so fundamentally the question is, we should not be protecting those sort of entities at all. And so I think that's the other challenge where I think Democrats really sort of messed up, is like, people don't feel like they have a lot of faith in democracy right now because it's not working for them, because we have a government that's working for these special interests. And so why are we trying to protect a status quo that clearly isn't working? And so I think Democrats need to really present sort of that new vision for how government should and could work for people, and bring us to sort of that sort of new reality. I think in Minnesota, we're figuring out some of those things where I think we're trying to create that government. There's still things that clearly aren't working right now, whether it's the fraud that folks sort of focus on. That is really a small percentage, though. I'm more concerned about things like the North Star Promise program, and how do we make sure more students are aware of this so that we don't have so many going into service jobs that maybe they don't really want to do. They want to do something else, and they're not realizing their full potential. And so I think it's groups like the Office of Higher Education role to sort of educate them. They're not doing a good job. So I guess I'm trying to come in from the outside and sort of help them out. But I think we need to figure out how to make government work better for people. And that is a way we can address it, because clearly we've been moving in the other direction for the past 4 decades here, and that's not working for folks at all.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective to hold. And I would agree that there's definitely, when you're promoting a democracy, it doesn't feel like it's working for people. They're not going to be as inclined to, quote unquote, save democracy then. So yeah, that's a unique perspective to hold, the one I haven't really thought of that way. But you talk about the Minnesota state government too, and all the fiascos that's going on right now, whether it's the Curtis Johnson seat, him not being a resident in his district that he won, and now they have the whole influx going on within the state house part of the government, and then also Kerry Dietzick passes away in the state senate, so there's a special election going on there, and then the Walls having the special election to replace that Curtis Johnson seat and that getting struck down by the state Supreme Court. How do you go about navigating what's going on at the state government with things that you're trying to implement?
I mean, I think the first thing is just I want to just mention just how critical former Senator Dietzick was to North Star Promise. She was actually one of the first bill authors in the program. So when we introduced this way back in 2018, she was one of the first to sort of sign on and just really had such a positive impact on this. And really, I think that is part of her huge legacy that she has. And obviously that was because of here at the University of Minnesota. I mean, she represents sort of this district largely for U of M students and wanted to make sure that when we created a free college program, it impacted not just community college students who I was advocating for at the time, but also University of Minnesota students. And so, she was really influential in doing that. And I think without her, I don't know if this program would have happened, because those initial conversations that we had in 2018 and 2019 set everything up for success during the 2023 sort of legislative session. In terms of sort of where we go from here, I think there's going to be some changes that are going to happen at the state. I mean, this is, I think, going to be a very difficult legislative session because of just some of the increases we're seeing both in certain programs within the state budget, but then also the expected Trump recession/depression. And that's something that no one's really talking about right now. And so the state is coming up with its budget projections for the next 2 and 4 years. And as they're looking forward, they're seeing that the economy is going to be in free fall. And what that means is there's going to be less income coming into the state. And as a result of that, we are moving from surpluses to deficits. And we have to understand, why is that happening? It's happening because of expected policies from President Trump, whether it's mass deportation, whether it's tariffs. That is all going to have a really negative impact on our economy. So I think that's piece number one. I think piece number two is some of these governmental programs, special education, healthcare costs have just continued to sort of rise exponentially. And so I think legislators are going to have to sort of figure out, how do we handle that? We have two choices. We can either start cutting those programs and leaving those folks out in the cold, or we can try to find other ways to sort of raise that revenue because they can't quite control all the aspects of the economy like the president can to sort of help things sort of rebound here from what we're expecting to sort of happen. And so I think that's going to be the navigation that's going on. And we've seen Governor Walz take more of a middle-of-the-road approach where he's made sort of cuts to essentially balance the budget. One of those places is that they're balancing the budget on the backs of students. I mean, his budget that came out is making some cuts. It's not dealing with some of the challenges that we're seeing on financial aid. And when you see how they're handling financial aid specifically, they're making significant cuts to programs that benefit student parents. And so they're changing the formula so that student parents get fewer financial aid dollars than other students. And so it's things like that that concern me sort of greatly, and things that I'm going to be fighting against at the Capitol, because I think we have to really sort of make important decisions about, if we're going to make cuts, who is that impacting, and really trying to protect, disadvantaged communities of this. Because if we don't, then those communities are not going to be involved in higher ed, or we have other communities that, aren't going to be able to survive as well, sort of in this environment.
Yeah, and you talk about the potential for a recession or depression to occur with whether it's mass deportation or the tariffs that are implemented. That's one thing that I look at with the recent headlines of what President Trump's been doing, whether it's going after illegal immigrants who have committed crimes and deporting them, and then how he wants to have millions and millions of illegal immigrants get deported out of the country too. And I think of it necessarily as you're not really solving the root problem of it, where it's just how dysfunctional the whole immigration system is, and you're kind of it's like a short-term quote-unquote solution to a problem that's much bigger than that. And then I think people are going to really feel the effects of that once maybe the people that help build, like shingle roofs are all of a sudden not showing up to work because they're worried about getting deported, sort of deal. Or people that go pick the crops in the fields and then all of a sudden they're not showing up to work again because they're in fear of getting deported. And then you see prices increase for these basic things, and then tariffs on top of that, and how like the external revenue system that he wants to create, and how I just think his whole understanding how tariffs work, and that it's not necessarily countries that are paying this tax, it's more the consumer. And
well, I think you highlighted an important point that Donald Trump is very performative in everything he does. It's not necessarily about results. It's about creating spectacles that make people feel like something's happening, but in reality, that's not. And I look at particularly sort of the mass deportation issue. So yesterday, there was a picture released by the White House that showed them have a number of handcuffed immigrants that were being boarded onto a military plane. But that's one picture that they're trying to present. That's not the reality. I mean, what's going on is they're going into local businesses. They're going into some cases schools. They're going onto Native American reservations. And they're basically, ICE is going into these places and asking people for their documentation. Yesterday there was an example of basically an individual who was a military veteran and them basically telling him that his documentation was not correct. I mean, we're talking literally American citizen who was a veteran, and they're sort of rejecting it. And this is what's happening right now sort of with this. And we're not even full deportation mode at this point. This is really just kind of the initial piece here. And so we have to understand that sometimes the information being fed to us is exactly that. It's garbage. And so understanding really what's going on, I think having an independent media on this is going to be sort of really critical on these pieces. And so really questioning some of that information. But like you point out, when we start deporting folks, it's going to have a negative impact. And right now, our economy is hungry for people with skills. And we need, I mean, you go to any place, you still see help wanted signs up right now. And so we're essentially struggling, our economy's struggling right now because we don't have enough workers. And what are we doing? We're going to start rounding up more people and sending them out of the country. That's just going to hurt us all because we're not going to have people, to your point, that are going to be able to do various tasks, whether that's, in healthcare. Some of these folks are nurses. Some of these folks are picking vegetables and our fruits and in the sort of meat packing sort of area. These are critical services that, quite honestly, some Americans just don't want to do. They're providing that, and when we remove them, it's going to have just a really negative impact on all of us. And I don't think folks really sort of fully understand that yet, and unfortunately, we're going to see the negative impacts. I mean, we might also see that he just does performative stuff. At the end of the day, he leaves a lot of the folks here, and so he just wants to show that he's doing something to sort of tamper down his base. I hope they're that smart. I worry they're not, though.
Yeah, we will see what happens in that regard. But yeah, it's certainly interesting times that we are living in right now. To wrap up here, I like closing on a more positive note with these podcasts. We've talked about a variety of things, but for you, what gives you hope for the future?
I mean, particularly young people. I mean, the reason I love doing the work that I do is really about helping young people find their own voice and then empowering them to create that positive change. Part of that goes back to, I remember when I was young. I'm not young anymore, but just the energy that you bring to that, the new perspectives you bring to the conversation. And so I enjoy working with young people to sort of tap into that passion, tap into that energy, and then sometimes sort of provide that mentorship, provide that direction that helps them be even more effective. And when we talked about free college, that's how free college happened. It happened because young people went up to the Capitol to advocate for it year after year after year, share their story, and that had positive impact. They went out and voted in huge numbers in the 2022 election. Then they also showed up at the Capitol, sort of push it over the finish line when we had major opponents up there as part of that. And so I think despite all this stuff with Trump, I think you're right. A lot of us can feel hopeless, but I think it is finding the energy of young people to figure out how we create some of these changes and how do we build resilience in what is probably going to be a very difficult 4 years. How do we also resist some of this work? Because, I'm not going to participate in folks being deported at all, and I'm going to create a stand for myself personally on that. And so what are you doing to sort of resist this action? But then also, how do we create long-term change and build a renaissance then that sort of brings us back to sort of what those founding fathers thought what democracy should look like. I don't think we still have lived out that true creed yet in the Declaration of Independence, where we're all men and women are created equal. And so how do we create that type of democracy? And that's the direction that I think we can head towards. It's just going through that process of building that resilience, finding some resistance as part of these policies, and then building that renaissance.
Yeah, it certainly seems like a pendulum throughout American history. It swings one way and eventually comes back to the other direction. So hopefully that holds true. But thanks again, Mike, for joining me. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Youth Perspectives. Of the many items we discussed, I found Mike's three-legged grassroots approach to be quite informative and useful. By having direct lobbying efforts, media relations skills, and well-organized advocacy, one can take a long-shot idea and make it law by utilizing the strength of the people. On top of this, I appreciated Mike sharing the story of his unsuccessful bid in running for city council while he was in college. Though he lost by only 5 votes, Mike's subsequent career in public policy demonstrates someone dedicated to making a positive change in any way they can, and the useful lessons we can all learn by not being afraid to fail. I also appreciated Mike's knowledge of higher education and the financial benefits affordable college can have on the student by preparing them for the workforce and the added tax revenue this would theoretically create for the state. This in turn would increase the overall standard of living for everyone if done correctly, but that's a topic for another episode. I'll close by quoting Malcolm X, who once said, "Education is our passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for it today." This is Mason Beerbaum, signing off.